It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My name is Greg Levin. I'm on the social impact team at Blackrock. Probably worth taking just a minute to explain why I'm up here. I think that there's largely two relevant reasons worth addressing. One is that I begged my way into this conference today. There's a lot to learn from, and eventually the Nest Insights team said that they would have me. But there's a trade. Any American that's joining on July 4th, they said had to work today, and you'll see that trend continue through the rest of the program. It's American exploitation at its finest, so thank you, Nest Insights, for that. The second reason that I think I'm here is that my team has endeavored to do some work on emergency savings and to support the incredible work that's been happening in emergency savings, largely in the US, hopefully with the help of many people in this room in earnest soon in the UK as well. So I'm here to learn and to share maybe just a bit of the context from the US side of things. Blackrock has committed to spending $50 million over the next 3 years to help build innovation and to scale existing programs in the emergency savings space. So if we get a chance, we'll touch on that a bit later today. I think we should probably bring the panelists on up here, and we can do just a very quick set of table setting, an introduction, while they make it up. So what I would say about these three just quickly is that we're going to hear them discuss their work on auto-enrollment and the lived experience of saving. You'll note that the panelists have each come at this theme from different angles, which is just a recognition of the fact that the context here is challenging, and that in order to truly understand the circumstances in which individuals are making savings decisions, and to ensure that our programs and interventions are in fact helping, or at the very least not hurting, those who we've set out to serve, we must understand the hurdles and trade-offs they're presented with. In order to do this, we need to take a truly holistic view of their work, and this means utilizing different, hopefully complementary methodologies to analyze it. So to that end, and without further ado, we're going to get to hear from Joe Phillips, who leads the Nest Insights research program, Dr. Hayley James, a researcher at the University of Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research on Aging, and Professor John Gathergood, Professor of Economics at the University of Nottingham. And we're going to learn about the quantitative, qualitative, and data analysis approaches they've brought to understanding how auto-enrollment affects people in the UK.
Good morning, everyone. As you know, and as Will has already mentioned, Nest Insights is working to understand people's experience of auto-enrollment over time. And as he said, particularly for people on low to moderate incomes, this means not just understanding their pension saving, but exploring more widely how saving in a workplace pension is impacting their broader financial lives. The research I'm going to share is a key part of building up that longitudinal understanding of auto-enrollment. It was supported by Legal & General Investment Management, and we're really grateful to them for their ongoing support of our work. We'd also like to thank the team at Harris Interactive who worked with us on this research. So our immediate aim was to understand what impact, if any, the first phased contribution rise had on Nest members. But in addition to that primary objective, this research is also our first detailed understanding about how our members' financial circumstances are developing over time. So our research questions were broader than the impact of contribution rises and broader than pension saving. We wanted to understand things like how attitudes and behaviours are changing, if at all. So, for example, are people becoming more or less confident in their retirement saving? We also started to explore, and this is an area that we're looking to explore a lot more in future, the relationship between retirement saving and other financial behaviours. So are people likely to save more or less beyond their retirement savings? Is there any change in levels of indebtedness? Does that go up, down, stay the same? And thinking more broadly, we explored whether and how members' financial well-being is being impacted by auto-enrollment as it evolves. So just before we dive in, let's take a quick step back to the context of this research. We've just had the final contribution rise a couple of months ago, taking total contributions up to 8%. Here we're talking about the rise before that, the one in April last year. As you all know, the levels of pension contributions were designed to be phased in over time to help employers and individuals adjust to the change. So in April of last year, at the start of the new tax year, the contribution levels were automatically raised. I'm sure these are numbers that you're all familiar with, but increasing to a 5% total contribution, 2% from the employer, 2.4% from the worker, and 0.6% of tax relief. So all workers who were enrolled in a pension scheme and already paying the minimum effectively had their own contribution levels tripled from 0.8% to 2.4%. It's worth remembering employers weren't required to notify their workers directly that their contributions were going to be automatically increased. This is communicated when a worker is first automatically enrolled, but there is no reason to believe that many employers were communicating at this time. As this increase was introduced to coincide with the start of the tax year, there are a number of other structural changes that it's really important to bear in mind as we go through what we found in this research. So first of all, the national living wage, which covers more than 2 million of the lowest paid workers, was increased by 4.4%. The personal allowance for income tax increased by £350, from £11,500 to £11,850, and national insurance thresholds also increased at the same time. And in addition, millions of people would have just received an annual pay rise in April. So there were a number of cushioning factors that happened at the same time as the contribution rise. And as a result, depending on people's personal circumstances, it's possible that a worker might have actually seen slightly higher take-home pay at this point. That's not the case for everybody, but it is possible for some people. So although at the time we saw headlines like contribution rise is going to be a harsh jolt for millions, or widespread fears that many could opt out as pension contributions triple, these contextual factors will have mitigated the impact of the contribution increase for many people, and it's worth bearing that in mind as we go forward. So in order to understand the impact of the rise, we surveyed Nest members before and after the event. So 6,827 actively contributing Nest members participated in a before survey, which took place in March and very early in April last year. So they were surveyed just on the cusp of the contribution rise. And we then waited 6 months for any effects to bed in. And the after survey was sent to everyone who completed the before survey and said that they were happy for us to recontact them. And 1,287 people took part between mid-September and mid-October last year. So when we talk about before and after in the results ahead, we're referring to these before and after surveys. It's also worth, this is probably obvious, but just pointing out that the survey was framed as generally understanding how people think about pensions, so we were not explicit that we were looking at the contribution rise in particular. So, what did we learn? I'm going to first look closer in at pension saving, exploring perceptions of affordability, people's awareness, their confidence, and then secondly, we'll zoom out and look more broadly at the interrelationship between pension saving and other saving and debt. So, affordability. We did not see any impact on perceptions of the affordability of pension saving in our survey. So only 1 in 20 members agree that too much of my income goes into my pension, and that remained steady before and after the rise. This is in line with data released by DWP, by Nest, by other pension providers after the contribution rise, which confirmed that opt-outs and cessations did not really increase. But even if there was no impact on actual contributions, we wanted to know, did some people think about stopping, but inertia held them back? They just didn't do anything about it. Actually, it looks to be more the case that people tend to increase their contributions, interestingly. So most members, 69%, did not consider changing their contributions. Only 4% considered decreasing or stopping their contributions. And over a quarter, 28% considered increasing them. And that consideration of increasing contributions is highest amongst men in their 30s, where it rises to 35%. But we know, of course, that very few people follow through. So only around very small percentages of Nest members make additional voluntary contributions, and there are clearly some barriers to overcome to translate this intent into actual action to raise contributions. Another hypothesis we explored was that people would feel less well off after the rise, that increased contributions could reduce financial resilience to pay an unexpected bill. In fact, we saw no net change in self-reported financial resilience. The proportion saying that they would be able to use their own money or would need to borrow to pay an unexpected bill of £300 within 7 days did not change significantly. So those who would have to borrow to pay that bill stayed steady at 28%. Younger members, those on lower incomes, were more likely to say that they'd need to borrow both before and after. The general picture on affordability, therefore, is that the first contribution rises didn't have any great impact. However, there's one small watch out to note. We think we may have seen early signs that sensitivity to pension contributions was increasing slightly. So forgive the double negative here, there was a drop in the proportion of members disagreeing they pay too much into their pension. So although we saw that agreement didn't really increase, disagreement did decrease quite a bit from 70 to 62%. And as you can see from the shrinking size of the orange part of the bars, this was particularly driven by the decline in those strongly disagreeing. So not a big watch out, but just something to keep an eye on there. Next, we explored whether there's been any shift in awareness of contributions. So one hypothesis that we had going in was that the contribution rise might make people more aware of the amount of their pension contributions, and perhaps that making higher and potentially more meaningful contributions would pave the way for greater engagement with pension saving. Actually, we saw a fall in awareness. So awareness of how much members personally pay into their pension fell from 64 to 57%. And as you can see from the line chart, the lowest awareness and the biggest drop in awareness is amongst under 30s, and particularly amongst men under 30. Perhaps unsurprisingly then, around half of Nest members didn't notice the increase in pension contributions. In fact, it's probably worth saying that around 8% didn't realise they were actually paying into a pension at all. So people were more likely to be aware that they were paying in more themselves, 44% said this, than to notice the increase in the employer contributions. Only 36% said this was the case. And the proportion that noticed that both had risen was about a third. So the idea that as you pay more, your employer pays more, which was some of the other headlines that were going around at this time, staying because you get that employer contribution, is not very well recognised. And this low awareness is despite the fact that 77% of members say that they look at their payslip when they get it. So this probably suggests that people are looking at take-home pay rather than their contributions. And indeed, we know employer contributions are often not shown on a payslip in any case. So this behavioural context has likely reinforced those cushioning effects that I mentioned earlier, the rises in living wage and income tax thresholds. People are looking at their take-home, which given other structural changes may not have changed very much. They're not noticing what's going on with their pension contributions. So finally, in our exploration of how pension-saving attitudes and behaviours are evolving over time, we wanted to know whether there'd be any impact on confidence on being able to provide for retirement. Overall, there's been a slight but not statistically significant increase in confidence in being able to provide for retirement. So we asked people, how confident are you that you will be able to financially provide for yourself in retirement, considering what you have put in place so far and plan to in the future? And we asked them to rate it on a scale of 0 to 10, where 0 was not at all confident and 10 was very confident. So the mean score out of 10s increased from 5.65 to 5.85, and the proportion with low confidence, so those who rated it 3 or less out of 10, has decreased from 35 to 29%. There's been little change at the high level in the extent to which members consider their pension will be their main source of retirement income. 40% believe this both before and after, so no change there. But interestingly, and perhaps encouragingly, there has been an increase in the proportion of older members who think their pension will be the main source of funding for retirement. This has gone up from 27 to 32%. So having looked close in at pension saving attitudes and behaviours, let's zoom out a little and take a brief look at the broader picture of members' personal finance. So first of all, did increased pension contributions replace more immediate saving? We found no indication that the presence of non-pension saving has changed, and neither has the frequency of saving. So 3/5 had savings at both before and after, and a quarter had no savings both before and after, which is obviously in line with the data from the Money and Pension Service that Will shared earlier. Members in their 50s are most likely to have money set aside, and members in their 30s are least likely. So we didn't see any real disruption to the savings picture, but there is that core group of people who have no savings consistently through both before and after. We also explored the concern that increased contributions could push members potentially more into debt. So we defined a member as over-indebted if they either found meeting monthly bills or commitments a heavy burden, or if they'd missed bill payments in 3 months out of the last 6 months. About the same proportion of members are over-indebted now as before the contribution rise, so about 14% at the after survey, 15% before. Under the surface of that, though, there was considerable fluctuation. So around a third of those who were over-indebted at the after survey had only become so in the period between the two surveys. And more members actually moved from having been over-indebted to no longer being so. So while it stayed steady at a total level, people are fluctuating and moving around quite a lot underneath the surface. There was also actually a slight reduction in individuals' perception of the amount of debt that they have. So although at a high level, there was relatively little impact that we could see in our survey in terms of the financial context, we did identify 3 groups to watch if we start to dig a bit below the surface, who are feeling the pressure a bit more than average. It's worth saying these groups are not mutually exclusive, so you could be in all 3. So the first is people in their 30s, which was 23% of NEST members. Members in their 30s were more likely to say that their debt level had increased compared to the NEST average, and they were also the least likely to save. The second group to keep an eye on is job changes, which was 7% of NEST members in that 6-month period. So NEST members who had changed jobs were significantly more likely to be over-indebted, and they were also more likely to have stopped saving outside of their pension saving. The third group to watch, perhaps most obviously, is those with debts to pay. So as we've seen, 8% of NEST members were over-indebted across both surveys, and members who were over-indebted are most likely to have become unaware of what they're paying into the NEST pension scheme. So potentially, although at the population level the picture is not much change, and we'd expect that to continue, potentially these groups would have been more at risk at the next rise. Many of the signs from this research are very positive. We saw a slight increase in confidence, we saw some interesting desire for voluntary contribution increases, and we saw an increase in the older members anticipating that their own pension will be their main source of their retirement income. Inertia has clearly been harnessed as a powerful force for good, but here's the but, and Will did the but earlier as well, we need to be mindful of the flip sides. So there are 2 areas we believe need further monitoring and evaluation in future. The first is, if people aren't aware of how much money is going into their pension, they're almost certainly not thinking about whether they're contributing enough to fund the lifestyle they want in later life. So we've seen people looking at take-home, not contribution amounts, a high proportion, over 2/5, not knowing what they're contributing. Given this low awareness, it's likely that few people are considering whether what they're putting in will be adequate for the retirement outcomes they hope for. This is in line with previous research that's found when people are automatically enrolled into pension saving, they're less engaged in it than if they had actively and voluntarily signed up to saving themselves. And it's possible that people trust that the default contribution levels have been set at an adequate amount, that they're seen as advised levels rather than minimum levels. So, I think I'm doing enough by just being in. This is perhaps, we talked about the at-risk groups, but this is perhaps a larger at-risk group, those who think they're covered but are actually likely to have a shortfall. Secondly, we need to better understand the relationship between pension saving and the broader financial context, particularly for those on low to moderate incomes brought into pension saving by auto-enrolment. So low opt-out rates and cessation rates are absolutely to be celebrated, and there's little, if any, evidence from this survey of any negative impact on levels of overall debt or non-pension saving behaviours. However, we believe this is worth further exploration, particularly to look at those subgroups below the surface, thinking about the 8% of NEST members who reported themselves to be over-indebted in both waves of the survey, and the 25% who had no liquid savings both before and after. If someone has high-cost debts, then it may well be better for them to pay those off. For some people, some of the time, not saving might be an appropriate course of action. And if someone has no liquid savings on hand for an emergency, despite the fact that they're saving into a pension regularly, they may experience negative impacts if a financial shock happens. Clearly, we're exploring this in our sidecar savings trial, and you can hear more on that over lunch today. This research relied on people telling us about their financial behaviours and circumstances. We're about to begin an exciting piece of research looking at the interrelationship between pension saving and debt, looking at actual behavioural data to understand what's happened since auto-enrolment has begun, which will hopefully allow us to get below that surface that we talked about here. And although it's too early to say at this stage what impact this year's contribution rises will have had, we will be releasing some analysis on that later in the year as part of our work with Vanguard in the next edition of How the UK Saves.
Well, hello again. So, good morning, everyone. It's very nice to be here, and thanks to NEST for organising this event and for inviting me along. My name's Dr. Hayley James, and I work at MICRA, the Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research on Ageing, and yes, that is a mouthful every time you have to say it. And I'm going to talk to you about my latest research that looked into individual decision-making after automatic enrolment into workplace pensions. And I'm really happy that actually a lot of the themes that Joe's already been talking about this morning really come through in what I've done as well. The findings of my research research highlight the complexity and variety of approaches to pension saving and the decisions around pension saving. These decisions that are often seen as kind of standardized or obvious to many people. This complexity was connected to the people's real life experiences, so their life status, their other financial practices, and so on. And it shows that workplace pensions aren't one size fits all, and we need different forms of support and intervention in order to encourage greater engagement with pension saving. It also means that different groups of people are vulnerable in different ways based on their differing life experiences and so on. So today I'm going to give you an overview of the research, in particular the methods used and the key findings arising from them. So the context of my research, as we've already discussed, many people aren't saving enough for their pensions. We know that automatic enrolment has done a wonderful job in getting people to participate in pension saving, and through this people are developing saving pots and saving habits, as well as accessing investments that they may not have had access to before. And that's great. And the but that we've already heard a number of times this morning, we know that a lot of the people automatically enrolled are saving at minimum levels, which may not be adequate for later life. But added to this, and this is the point that I find really interesting, exciting, is that pension scheme participants don't seem to be engaging with the financial incentives, such as employer matching or tax benefits, to increase their contributions above the default levels. And it's not really clear how to encourage them to engage with pension saving above those default levels. So this posed a question that needed research, and specifically qualitative research. There's lots of very fruitful research in this area, so we know a lot about the kind of overarching trends, but we know less about how people actually think about their own pension. Why do they think they're paying into a pension? And how they experience that decision in the context of their everyday real-world practices. I believe that understanding how people actually practice their pension decisions and practice their pension saving will help us to develop better support and interventions for people who are at risk at inadequacy in later life. And that's not just about increasing contributions, but maybe different ways of approaching pension saving as well. So this research aims to consider how individuals approach decisions about their pension after being automatically enrolled, whether they had opted out, stayed at minimum contribution levels, or increased their contributions. This was based on in-depth interviews with 42 employees and 7 second interviews with 7 of those participants, drawn from 3 case study companies who had already implemented automatic enrolment. There were 26 female and 16 male participants, aged between 20 to 49 years old, and incomes ranged between £10,000 per year to over £60,000 a year, although there were fewest participants in the £10,000 to £20,000 per year earning group. This meant that participants were generally on middle incomes and in relatively stable jobs. So these people could be expected to be, dependent on DC in later life and have access to a pretty good pension scheme in order to save for it. So therefore, this was kind of fertile ground for exploring, how people in traditional employment with access to a good pension scheme actually think about and approach decisions about their pension. My research found that approaches to pension saving were complex and varied. By examining how decisions varied by the level of contribution, so whether people were paying nothing or minimum levels or increased levels, and also by looking at the proportion that contribution represented in their total saving, I identified a typology with 4 different approaches to pension saving. These approaches can be understood as ideal types, in the sense that participants did not necessarily fit neatly into one box, but were inclined to one type more than the others. These approaches connected to the individual's personal context, and by that I mean, the financial challenges they face, their life status, other things in their life, basically, with some trends in kind of observable socio-demographic determinants, such as age and income, but generally this was more about a subjective sense of how they felt and how they approached their world. I'm going to talk through these briefly in turn. So the first group was the threshold adults. These were people who were right at the start of their pension saving journey. This approach involved limited pension participation, which was justified by the prioritization of other goals related to adulthood. The threshold adults had either continued to save at minimum levels passively without doing anything, or they decided to opt out of pension saving. And they felt that they would only engage with and really start thinking about pension saving once they had achieved the goals that they felt established them as an adult. So buying a house, having children, achieving a stable job. This wasn't about affording the contributions per se, because even where they could afford to make additional contributions and they knew about the financial incentives available in terms of employer matching, for example, they still just didn't want to think about pension saving. As an example, Toby was in his early 20s, had stayed at minimum contributions while he was saving for a house, and he said, when I asked why he'd stayed at minimum contributions, he said, I think it's worthwhile. It's not a considerable amount of money, but at least you were contributing something, especially at my age anyway. I'm only 24. At a younger age, you don't tend to think about pension saving. This was very typical, this idea that you could be too young to save, and also that minimum contributions are enough for the time being. Now, none of that really sounds irrational, does it? And I think that we can see that automatic enrolment has at least been successful in encouraging these young people to save at a minimum level. But the subjective nature of the threshold adult approach meant that some people could be passive about pension saving well into their 30s, based on how quickly they were able to achieve those, feeling that establishment of adulthood. And we must also reflect on the fact that some threshold adults were more able to achieve the goals, such as buying a house or achieving job security, than others, playing out privileges of social, cultural, and economic capital. People who had resources could establish themselves in adulthood more quickly, start engaging with pension saving earlier, and would be therefore more likely to achieve adequacy over their lifetime. And that, culmination of privilege over time, I think, is something that we should really be aware of. Many threshold adults need support that reflects the realities of their life experience in order to overcome the significant challenges they face in establishing their adult lives. The next group is the protectionist savers. These were people who had actively increased their pension contributions, and often it was after achieving the kind of goals set out by the threshold adults. So this was almost the next perspective, the continuation. But their pension represented quite a large chunk of their saving and investment portfolio, so they weren't tending to do much saving and investing outside of the pension. However, the approach to pensions was underpinned by an acceptance of pension saving as a social norm. What this meant was that protectionist savers didn't really know much about their pension and didn't really want to know or didn't want to make decisions about it. They were just happy to be part of the system, and they kind of assumed the system would look after them. This is where we see matched contributions really being seen as a recommendation as to what they should be saving, and that kind of almost reinforced the social norm even further. For example, Izzy was in her mid-20s and had bought a house with help from her parents and increased her contributions when she'd got a permanent job. When asked about this, why she decided to do this, she said, "I suppose you pay into a pension because it's the right thing to do. I suppose you just follow suit, don't you? Because everyone else does it." While the protectionist saver group represents people who are active savers, saving more than the minimum levels, there's still a concern about what might happen to them when they reach retirement. They were generally not really aware that their pension might not deliver adequacy in retirement, especially as they considered that employer matching a recommendation. But perhaps they were also not willing to consider that it might not provide for them as well. But either way, this leads to a kind of false sense of security around their pension, and that could prove particularly challenging for people who thought they were doing the right thing all along. I think this is really important for policy solutions that try to engage people try to increase saving without engaging people, because people end up constructing their own assumptions about what those defaults mean. So the skeptical speculators, which is a tongue twister. When I named this, I should have thought about how many times I'd have to say that out loud. They limited their pension saving in workplace pensions because they weren't confident that the system would deliver the sort of outcomes they needed. They felt they could achieve better outcomes for their later lives through other forms of saving and investing. So things like ISAs, business investments, property, stocks and shares, as well as more speculative things such as Rolex watches and art. They saw these things as short-term and long-term. It wasn't that they weren't thinking about the long-term, and they were very active savers, or at least they reported being so. They were generally aware that these things could be more volatile than pensions, but they wanted to take responsibility for their saving and investment decisions. Many felt there was a lack of access or control in workplace pension savings compared to other platforms, and highlighted this as a reason for not engaging more with pensions. Richard was in his 20s and had opted out of pension saving because he worried about the possibility of changes that would affect his entitlement. He said, "My worry is they sell it to you as a good thing, but as you approach retirement, they start to retract aspects of it or impose additional rules or sanctions that you have to follow." Richard's "they" here was referring to pension providers and employers who kind of set the rules of the scheme, but he also felt that there was a role of government regulation that's supporting the system, that could change as well. Now, I'm sure some of you might think that this perspective maybe lacks foundation, but actually there was quite a substantial number of people in this group. And among them, there were lots of people who were educated and also financially literate. So I think it really is something that we have to take seriously. It's unclear to what extent automatic enrolment had been good for them. Some of them were saving at minimum levels, had been automatically enrolled and had done nothing about it, just stayed in anyway. And they saw this a bit like, oh, well, I might as well just keep doing it now I've been automatically enrolled, even though they still felt skeptical about it. But on the other hand, I think events such as contributions going up automatically and also being automatically enrolled did seem to reinforce their skepticism because they wanted to be involved and in charge of their investments and their decisions. This was driving them towards other investments which potentially exposed them to different and maybe greater investment risks. While the skeptical speculators were very aware of those risks, I do think we need to evaluate whether this is a direction we want people to go in. And resolving that sort of skepticism is probably not about just communication or scheme level changes. We need to consider how we can alleviate some of these underlying factors, such as limiting changes in provision, more transparency, and more participation. The last group then, the market investors, were very active in terms of managing their pension as part of their portfolio. They were active pension savers who'd increased their contributions, but unlike the protectionist savers, the pension was a relatively small part of their overall portfolio. They were very active in diversifying across different platforms, and they did this in order to maximize their returns. The employer contribution was very important in their decision as they sought to benefit from the free cash available to them, and these people always spoke about free cash. It was really marked them out. This approach was probably the closest to that envisaged as rational choice, and probably closest to how we think pension savers should behave, as it appeared to be calculative and maximizing. Yet, the market investors were not always fully analyzing options available to them when it came to making decisions about their pension. For example, they generally didn't concern the role of charges or investment schemes on what they might get in the future. Will, who was in his early 30s, paid increased contributions to his workplace pension, as well as to a self-invested personal pension. He said, "Well, I guess my dad has always said pensions were good. I put in the max up to where the match is best. It's free cash, right? I guess I'm fortunate enough that I don't need that money for monthly living." Will is describing how his approach is to maximize their inputs to his pension, with little consideration of the output that might lead to. We can all agree that, in theory, maximizing inputs should lead to greater outputs, of course, providing the scheme is well managed over time, charges are reasonable, and so on. So this suggests that even the market investors are still maybe exposed to risks of poor scheme management and overconfidence. But I think it's really important what Will says next, that he's fortunate enough not to need that money. He doesn't need it for his monthly living, so he doesn't need to worry about what the outcome of investing in his pension might be. The market investor group tended to be older, wealthier, and more confident in their financial knowledge, so they were benefiting from access, resources, and forms of capital in following this approach. It may not be a surprise that despite the underlying female bias in the sample, the group was overwhelmingly male, with 8 out of 9 members of this group being men. And the one female member described herself as the breadwinner in her family, so she was taking on very male social roles. And this is the point I'd really like to end on, that in practice, pension decisions are not about right or wrong, but instead relate to the complexities of people's everyday experience. The market investors, who were the most engaged group and behaved the most like we expect pension savers to behave, had specific knowledge, access, social and economic capital, compounding the effects of the privilege that was seen with the threshold adults as well, right at the start of their pension saving journey. It suggests that it's unlikely that everyone could follow the market investor approach. In particular, the gendered nature of pension decision-making may serve to reinforce the disadvantages women face in the pension systems that don't take account of their real-life experiences, such as career breaks and lower pay. And I think these are issues that deserve attention from across the pensions landscape.
Okay, so many thanks. So in the next few minutes, I'm going to say a few things about the positives of Nest. I think there's a lot of positives so far. And then I'm going to say a few things about the challenges, both to understanding the effects of Nest as a pension, and then understanding how it fits into the broader pensions landscape in the UK. And then I'll say a few things about analysis, the kind of analysis that can and should be done, the kind of data that we now have available that allows us to do really precise and sophisticated analysis of some of these issues. Okay, so I think that Nest is generally a good idea. In the UK, we have a very low state pension, the lowest in the OECD. You don't want to be reliant on the state pension alone. Even with pension credit in the NHS and such the like, being reliant on the state pension in the UK is not a great financial position to be in. So only being covered by the state pension is not a great scenario. Moreover, the way the national insurance system works in the UK is that the rate of return on national insurance contributions is at best zero and for most people negative. So paying more national insurance isn't a way to cover you very well for your retirement saving. So given that, there was this big group of people who seemed only to be reliant on the state pension, which is not a good idea, and they weren't enrolling for pensions. Auto-enrollment does seem to have moved towards filling a pretty big gap. And it's one of the biggest insights from behavioral economics that when you switch between these opt-in and these opt-out programs, they have enormous effects, and here they seem to be having positive effects. Moreover, as a pension, Nest is a pretty good pension design. When you put your money into the pension, you have the employer match, you have tax-favored contributions, and then where you actually put your money, the funds that are available, it's a pretty good set of funds. There's a lot of funds available, a lot of diversification options. The fees are very low. The ongoing charges are very, very low. In fund management, you don't get very much for paying higher fees. Often you get worse product. So having index funds with low ongoing costs and charges is a good thing. Moreover, it gives people who are typically lower income exposure to the positive effects of equity returns, which is something that lower income groups are typically cut off from in most of the financial system. So actually having lower income groups investing in equity returns over a long time horizon is a good thing. They get in on the benefits of being stockholders. And that's done responsibly because the default funds within Nest are the life strategy funds that change the asset allocation mix as you move towards a retirement date, decreasing the risk profile. And given that most people are just sticking with the default fund option, the responsible thing to do is put them on an asset allocation trajectory, which is going to take them to retirement with the right kind of mix. And then the final good thing to say about Nest, and it may be a particularly important feature of this kind of pension scheme, is that it has very low cost transfer. So there's no in or out charges. And that's really important for this group of individuals who may be moving between multiple employers, some of whom offer occupational pensions, some of whom don't. They may have kind of legacy pensions. To be able to transfer in and transfer out at no charge is an important thing in this demographic, in this group. So it's positive stuff. And I'll have a couple of slides of kind of challenges and concerns. And the biggest message is that when you think about the effects of something like auto-enrollment into Nest, you want to try to think about the overall effects on the individuals enrolled and on the firms who now have this new obligation. It's very tempting to look narrowly and say, well, there's people now with pensions and they're putting money into this pension, so that's a success because there's a particular pot of money that they are accruing. We need to try and think broadly. It's possible that the default contribution rates in Nest could have unintended consequences by signaling that this is an adequate amount of retirement saving. You've got to be really careful about that. The government has invented a pension that says, I put this much in and my employer puts this much in. So it's a possibility that people infer this is some kind of prescription, some kind of advice as to how much you should save. And some international studies have shown that arguably defaults in auto enrollment can reduce saving for certain groups who might have saved more but now seem to stick with the default that you offer them. So that speaks to the point of savings adequacy, and the broader picture there is we need analysis to understand the adequacy of individual saving. It's not an easy question to take on. There's lots of sources of potential sources of wealth and retirement to fund your consumption. There's lots of different risks, lots of interactions with elements of social security, but it's the biggest question: to what extent is Nest improving adequacy? Well, we think it probably is for most people, and how far do contributions need to go in order to build up adequate replacement rates in retirement for people in the UK? You might also be concerned that that Nest pot is building up, but what's happening to other savings? It would be unfortunate if what was being achieved through these kind of schemes is that money going into Nest, a lot of that is money that would have gone into other forms of saving, which is just being substituted away, giving us the illusion that people are saving more. Now, that's probably not what is happening among these groups, given the income levels and what we know about the distribution of wealth in the UK. But we want to try to achieve something where new saving is going on and not pure substitution. And then on the debt side, there's a couple of things to think about. So Nest is putting this program in place of increasing savings rates for low-income individuals who face a lot of different risks, and one of these risks is the liquidity risk, the risk that income is variable, spending is variable, and they need money in the short term. They don't have big buffers of savings. It would be unfortunate if by taking at source out of payroll pension contributions, you're taking away emergencies, liquidity, necessary liquidity that people might need to fund expenses that much. You don't want to perversely push people into high-cost credit or payday loans or revolving credit card debt because they have an expenditure need today which could have been met by reducing their pension saving at much lower cost overall, but isn't because the money's been taken at source. So that's where the sidecar savings trial is a great idea. So the idea there is that as well as having the long-term retirement saving pot, you also have like an emergency, what we call a sidecar pot that people can draw on, because you don't want to improve people's net worth if you kill their liquidity and leave them exposed to shocks. So you need to be careful about that potential outcome. It's an unintended thing that could happen through this design. I know that David later on will talk more generally about unintended outcomes that could happen from these kinds of designs. And then broader challenges within the pensions landscape in the UK. There's a very strange combination of big pension reforms that have gone on in the UK in the last 10 years. In the accrual phase, we have decided that there's a large chunk of the population who aren't saving enough, so we're going to automatically enroll them into this new Nest pensions. In the drawdown phase, we now have the world's most liberal drawdown opportunities when you reach age 55 with what you can do with your pension pot. Now, this seems somewhat of a strange combination of things to do, because we've moved to auto-enrollment because we presume that there was some savings gap, maybe brought about by procrastination. People have poor financial literacy, not understanding pensions. And so we felt the need, and behavioral economics kind of informs us that we might have the need to go and enroll people to do something with a strong nudge, right? But now in the UK, age 55, you can do what you like with your pension pot. You have no need to annuitize. There are no rules on drawdown. There's tax incentives, but in principle, you can take all of it. So these people who we thought might have problems with time consistency in their decision-making and poor financial literacy aged in their 20s and 30s, is it the case that as soon as you reach 55, this is all gone? You're now an educated, time-consistent, sensible planner, and we'll give you your pension pot to do with what you wish. So there's no need to annuitize in the UK anymore at all. So you could, unfortunately, end up in a situation where you build up these pots of money for relatively low-income people to access at age 55, and age 55, they go and blow it on something, right? They don't actually use it in the way you had intended to fund their retirement. Now, a slightly technical point is that the combination of this move to auto enrollment and taking the long view on people's accruals and the liberalization at age 55 of the drawdown rules does leave the fund structure in a little bit of a mess, because you default people into life strategy funds with an intended crystallization date in mind, but the pensions freedom rules means you don't have to crystallize anymore. And we're not going to go buy an annuity. So the risk profile aiming for a so-called target retirement date, where you're going to crystallize and historically go buy an annuity, that's not what people are doing anymore, right? So the asset allocation structure into retirement should probably be more steered towards equities, because these monies are going to stay in funds for longer and for later. That's a bit of a technical point about the fund structure. Now, thankfully, with these big questions about the overall effects of Nest and how it interacts with different aspects of household finances, nowadays we can address these very rigorously, because we can join up sources of data. An additional thing over and above survey data, which is insightful but does have limitations in its accuracy, in particular about financial circumstances, over and above that, we can join up individuals' Nest records with things like their credit files or their tax filing histories. Or if you have a willing retail bank, you could actually join up data with personal current accounts. So then we can do some analysis to understand how is the accrual phase of saving interacting with the debt portfolio in the credit file, and how is it interacting with the transactions and liquidity in the current account. And one of the great things which is going to happen in the analysis which is coming online and part of Nest Insight is to do that credit file linking. So we can check to see whether these increases in retirement saving are being offset to some extent in higher debt, or maybe leading individuals to be more reliant on short-term high-cost credit. We can check whether that's happening. Now, alongside that data linking, which is really, really valuable, Nest also offers some fantastic natural experiments to allow us to establish causality. Because you can link up enormous amounts of data, but unless you have a means of doing analysis to say A is causing B, just linking up the data in itself often isn't sufficient. But because Nest has seen these stepped up contribution rates over time, and because Nest has seen rules about the obligations on firms to enroll their employees by number of employees, with quite sharp discontinuities at the number of employees you have, that gives us natural experiments, as we call them, to allow us to do analysis. So we can analyze Nest in the same kind of way that the working families tax credit has been analyzed, and the other elements of the tax system in the UK have been analyzed, using very detailed data and using these nice kind of statistical features. So I'm optimistic that these questions and potential challenges that we have around the effects of Nest are things we can address using these new data linkages and using the kind of statistical methods that we now have available in our suite to understand these deep questions.
We're going to start with a little conversation up here, and then we'll turn it over to all of you. I just want to note that Matthew from Nest Insights yesterday shared with me that they really like the idea of provocative statements and provocative questions in this forum. And I just want to point out that John started by saying Nest is generally a good idea, a pretty good pension, and a pretty good set of funds, which felt very provocative at a Nest Insights conference. But he's in a very good mood because of the cricket yesterday, he informed me. So let's start with a question about confidence. and how that ties through to saving for the future. And perhaps we'll talk about the protectionist element of your work, Dr. James, and then John, how default signaling, how that's involved. So to tie it all the way back through, confidence is potentially going up, or at least not going down as these rates are going. Is that a good thing in this case?
Yeah, so I think, as several people have said, lots of people are now saving into a pension who weren't saving into a pension before. And so that is to be celebrated, and some confidence there is a good thing. But we want to make sure that that is true, well-founded confidence and not false confidence. So some of the other concerns that people have raised about, okay, so there's money going in, but are people looking ahead to whether that's going to meet their expectations when they come to later life? Is that going to enable them to continue the lifestyle that they're used to and have the outcomes that they want in later life? And I think that's where, we've all raised concerns that just understanding a bit more about whether people are looking ahead, and certainly in Hayley's research, we've seen that in some cases a lot of the decision making is focused around now and not looking ahead. So there is lots to celebrate in terms of increased saving and increased confidence, but there are also some concerns that we need to be aware of.
And how do we think about that in either of your work, thinking about the default as being seen as a norm or perhaps a recommendation? So as the rates of deposit are going up, and we're potentially more confident about this, we're seeing a norm, and that's a recommendation from the government or from a pension provider that in fact this is enough to get me through retirement.
Yeah, I think, echoing what Joe said, it does seem that people are really, just not really thinking about or really evaluating what they will get in later life. Very few of my participants had any sort of idea of what their retirement would be like, what type of lifestyle they would want in retirement, even though, some of my participants were in their 40s, you'd think they might be approaching thinking about it. Overall, people really didn't have much of an idea. So there was this kind of false confidence, especially amongst the protectionist saver group, where people felt that by participating, they felt they'd be looked after. And the real challenge here was when I started to probe this with people in interviews, they got really, really defensive. It was really noticeable that as soon as you start saying, well, actually, what if it doesn't provide? People, clammed up and kind of wanted to finish the interview there and there. So there is something really challenging here that people may have to face in the future if the pension doesn't live up to their expectations.
How does that sound?
Yeah, so you are concerned with default effects. Work in a number of ways, right? Firms might consider this to be the government's advised pension. A firm that might have thought of potentially offering higher contribution rates might decide Nest is enough. For example, individuals as well might have thought it was enough. We are coming from a baseline where saving appeared to be low, right? So saving has gone up. That's a good thing. I don't think the answer to savings adequacy is to try and find the number. Should it be 11%? Should it be 10%? Because there's a big distribution of patterns of income and expenditure and risks that people in the population face, right? And what people need is means of getting sensible advice on the whole about your housing and your family and how many workers there are in your household and the rights that you have in lots of different pension schemes to understand how much you should be putting into Nest, just in the same way that everyone has to figure that decision out. So I don't think it's about there being like a magic contribution rate number. It's more about trying to support people to get an overall view of what their retirement saving in its widest portfolio looks like.
And behaviorally, just thinking about someone who's potentially a saver for the first time or has an effect where they're thinking about saving for retirement for the first time, is that in and of itself enough of a net positive to be happy about?
I think so. There are competing needs early in life, like housing, for example. The student loan thing isn't really a risk to your retirement saving because the student loan is extremely cheap in the UK. Given that the employer match is large and that the tax benefits are very large, I think it makes sense for the vast majority of people to get into this, even if they're trying to save a deposit for a house or something like that, right? I'm more concerned about the liquidity thing. Right? Low-income households having exposure to risks, and that this month, the fact that they put money away in Nest, that maybe should have been money they took this month to find an emergency need, and they're having to go somewhere for that, which is really expensive.
So normally when we're talking about, in my work in our context, talking about emergency savings or the sidecar work here, there's a picture of Professor Leibson in our office. He's not generally sitting in front of me. So I'm a little hesitant because this version can say countervailing things. But will you talk a little bit more about, and maybe Joe, based on what you've seen to date, or I know I don't want to spoil lunch around the sidecar savings pilot, but what's your response to that concern?
I think what we're all really pointing towards and what the analysis that John talked about and that we're all looking to increasingly do points towards is the need to de-aggregate. And a lot of the research that I've just shared paints a positive picture at the high level, but there are sort of two really interesting groups in there for me. There's the over a quarter who thought about increasing their contributions and have done nothing about it. So there's a group there who are thinking about it, but how do we behaviorally make that easier for them? And then there's the other quarter, don't know how much overlap there is, who have no liquid savings, who are putting money aside regularly into a pension. And I think the more we're able to understand under the surface, where are the at-risk groups, where are the groups who actually could be supported to save more because they're open to it and they have that elasticity in their household finance and they're up for it, versus those who actually we need to think about their broader circumstances before we think about potentially increasing contributions so that there aren't detrimental effects in other areas of their life, which, as Will said earlier, could have an impact when they get to retirement and mean that the money they've saved might not go as far if they've still got debts to pay afterwards.
And how much solace should we take in the fact that only 4%, I want to make sure I get this right, only 4% considered decreasing or stopping their pension contribution?
Yeah, so I think we've seen the power of the default, we've seen the power of inertia. There weren't high levels of opt-out when the contributions rose last year. We don't anticipate that there will be high levels this year. So there is still some room there. But I guess what we don't know and what we're all getting to is if people aren't necessarily aware of the contributions that they're making and their contributions have gone up, but they don't know that, they're not clocking that, are there potentially negative effects for some people that they may not be aware of but hit them further down or are not joined up with the understanding of the pension saving?
And maybe last one from me, because this touched a nerve on my side. The market investors that you talked about, Dr. James, and you referenced an early 30s person who was thinking about maximizing inputs, but not necessarily thinking about the fees and the outputs. Let's say you have someone on stage who's a late 30s person who thinks about maximizing their inputs and hasn't spent the time on the outputs piece. How much of a concern do you think that should be for a younger audience, especially given the idea that John talked about, that perhaps Nest actually has a very good structure for this?
Yeah, I wouldn't say this is a concern as much for those individuals, just more when we look at how we think about how pension savers behave overall. I mean, these people were the closest to what we often think of as kind of, rational choice, sensible decision making, and they still had this kind of failing going on. I think we should recognise that actually it's very hard to think about what the outcomes of your pension might be. Individuals can't necessarily do that. Even these people who had the access, the resources, the financial knowledge, they still weren't really able to think about what their outcome will be. So maximising inputs is a great proxy for that, right? You maximise inputs as much as you can. So I don't think it's a bad thing for someone in their late 30s who might be maximising. I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But I think we have to think about what are the implications of that for the system generally.
Yeah. That's great. And this is one place where there's plenty of places here where I'm totally out of my depth, but UK specifically, John, you talked about what effectively sounds like a decumulation problem at the end. So we often talk about accumulation. Are we sure that people are getting enough into the system? In a US context, at least our firm is spending a lot of time thinking about what decumulation looks like, specifically on life path products on the back end. Do you mentioned that as a potential concern here based on policy. Any last thing to say on that?
It's just the disconnect between what's going on at different stages. The implicit ideas about how we think people are behaving in different stages of the life cycle are remarkable. As I say, early on in the life cycle, we think people are procrastinating, not making good choices, not being time consistent in their planning. And yet, in the drawdown phase, we now have the most kind of liberal regime where you can take all of it straight away, which is a remarkable thing to do. Given that you did the first thing, doing the second thing is a remarkable combination.
Right. Okay, next year's conference, we'll get into that. We have some microphones around. There's one right here. Yes, sir, right behind you.
Hello, Henry Tapper of HWH. We learned this morning from Baroness Boscombe that the take-up rate on pension credits is currently 60%. That means that 40% of people eligible for pensions credit, the kind of people we're talking about today, are simply not taking them up. Should we be auto-enrolling people into pension credit? And are we having this conversation about the wrong thing?
Anyone want to jump in?
So I think that pension credit is it's a supplement for people who have very little retirement income, particularly if you're reliant on the state pension alone. It's a credit that tops you up. Should people be kind of automatically given these kind of benefits? What I would probably think is a good idea, because we are talking about people on exceptionally low income. So I'd be surprised if that 40% is mostly people who don't need the money, right? I'd be very, 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 very surprised. It's more likely to be people who can't figure out the form or don't even know it exists. Is pension credit a solution? Well, I mean, pension credit is just extending the domain of Social Security, right? So that's a completely different approach to covering retirement saving, right? And in the big picture, we have, as a nation, has decided to move to a system of individual accounts and to try to encourage retirement coverage that way, rather than just extending Social Security. So that's a kind of a completely much, much bigger question, really.
In the back?
Mark Fawcett from Nest. So this is mainly for Professor Gathergood. So first point of fact, when pensions freedoms came in, we actually, along with many other schemes, changed the glide path to not assume annuitization, so you keep risk on the table, albeit a 65-year-old can't take as much risk as a 45-year-old or 25-year-old. But you made a point that people need to kind of optimize their level of saving based on advice and figuring out all the different factors. Doesn't the point about that you made about pension freedoms and auto-enrollment is people can't work this out for themselves, and there's not enough advice available for 10 million new savers. So you've got to have default paths all through retirement, all through accumulation and decumulation. So schemes need to be able to offer default decumulation paths so people don't have to work it out because they can't.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's this big advice kind of gap. It's very difficult to find a financial advisor with your best interests at heart. It's very, very difficult to find good financial advice. Financial advisors will stop you doing something completely stupid, but they're unlikely to advise you to do something that's right, because they have to make money from giving you advice. And that fundamentally often means that they're very conflicted incentives in the UK system. But good point about decumulation phasing.
We'll come to the front after this. Yes, sir?
Nigel Stanley, I'm chair of the Nest members panel. We're talking about adequacy and how contributions might increase. The government's proposal is not to increase contributions, but to start them from the first pound. And of course, we use as shorthand the idea that people pay 8% contributions. In fact, no one pays 8% contributions because of the effect of the earnings band and the fact that, particularly for low-paid people, an awful lot of their pay doesn't attract their own contributions, tax relief, or employer contributions. What do the panel think might be the impact of reducing contributions from the first pound so people are paying more that way? And are there mitigating policies that they can think of that might ease that kind of implementation and reduce the danger of people opting out when they're faced with those increases they have to pay?
I can do that. I think in the survey research that we did with members, we saw that there is some capacity to cope with change like that if it coincides with other structural changes that have a cushioning effect. That seems to be quite an important part of the picture of the contribution rise. So I think, if we've learned anything from that, it's that it's good to put those changes together so there is some cushioning effect at the same time that there is a change. So that would be, certainly something to consider there.
Can I add something as well? So I think in my research I found that overall people hadn't really, were quite passive about saving. So as contributions automatically increased, they didn't really seem to pay much attention, didn't really mind. But I do share your kind of concern that actually people on lower incomes, it's a bigger impact, you know, the increases of these sort. And I think there is always going to be a tipping point, right, where people don't notice, and then all of a sudden they've got double the amount going out of their pay packet, and that affects their everyday life, their monthly living. One thing I found really clearly in my research is that people, when they were thinking about changing something like savings rates, they were happiest to do it at a point when other things in their life were changing. So kind of leading on from what you said, Joe, but we talk a lot about like save more tomorrow in the industry about, you know, increasing or changing your contribution rates when you get a pay rise. But actually even things like changing house, moving house or something like that could be a time when people are reevaluating their saving, and actually they'd feel more comfortable taking an increase on board at that point. So I guess my advice, and I don't know the case for specifically low-income workers, but I would say, is there a way that we can ask people when they'd like to build these sort of increases into their own lives? At what point in their lives is this the right time for them to take something like that on?
Great. Thanks.
Hi, John Parker from Reddington. We've talked a lot about affordability, and of course there are three parties involved in auto-enrolment, the members, the employers, and the government. I just wondered to what extent, through perhaps any broader work that the panel may have done, about how affordable employers think auto-enrolment is, and whether we should be focusing more of our efforts on trying to get them, either voluntarily or through public policy, to take more of the burden on.
We, after we'd done this research, LGIM hosted a round table kindly on the research that we did, and we had some employers present at that round table. And I think it's really difficult because they were employers who wanted to do well by their employees, but also we're seeing that employees aren't really noticing the employer contribution. So as a benefit offered by the employer, it's clear that, you know, a lot of people don't even notice that, let alone appreciate it. So I think it is difficult, you know, even for employers who would perhaps like to contribute more to raise the money going in, to weigh that up against all the other benefits decisions and all the other ways that they could potentially look after and retain their employees. It's difficult.
I can't say. I didn't involve the employers very much. I don't have much to add on that.
I mean, you do want to try and understand, so whether to some extent this is working as tax on employment, you want to understand the effect that it has on startup rates of firms, for example, right? That might be affected by this kind of, it might affect the size to which a firm grows, for example, to the threshold rules or historical threshold rules. So, you know, this is not like free money from the employer that's coming out of the sky, right? They have to find some means of paying these contributions, and so you should do some work to understand the effect on the employer side, especially about it becoming a payroll tax that decreases, you know, the incentive to employ someone in the first place.
I've had an anti this side of the room bias. Are there questions on this side? Right here, sir.
I'm coming.
Coming to you.
Hi, it's Tom Bourban. I'm retired now, but I was deputy chair at Nest for a number of years. I got the sort of sense that, you know, people were being a bit sort of hard on the state pension. I mean, I think for the low paid, the state pension has been very important. And in fact, you know, people, the poorest people retiring now are getting more money now than they were when they were actually working. So, you know, it has been a very good thing. And I think, you know, when we're looking at, you know, what people are retiring at and whatever, I agree entirely that it's very difficult to give people any sense of what they're going to get. But I think that we do have to think about, for the very low paid, how we factor in the fact that they will get a state pension which is actually, 7,500 or whatever it is. If it's a couple, it's 15,000 quid a year, with some index linking protection and whatever. And I think that ultimately we need to, when we think about how we're going to help people to understand what they're saving and what they need to save through Nest and auto-enrolment, that it would be dangerous for us to ignore and not try to make sure people actually understood that they had an underpin of the state pension, and therefore actually it may not be such a bad thing for them to take money out at age, well, not 55, but at a late, at some point in there to use that. So I don't know whether you were being a bit flippant in terms of saying it wasn't important to think about the state pension, but I think that the state pension, in aggregate, it may be low compared to other countries, but for the poorest, it's actually become quite an important part of their retirement income sources.
Does anyone want to say nice things about the state pension?
I think just to say that it is a really important foundation, and for some people on lower incomes, that foundation plus auto-enrolment minimum contributions makes a really significant difference and may in fact be enough. And that's again where, looking at a sort of blanket contribution rise for everybody is difficult, thinking about the subtleties within that and where people might need and be able to save more, and where that might be a good thing when we think about their picture in the round versus where actually, a little bit of a top-up might make a difference. And I think for the individual to see the state pension foundation as part of that with what they're already doing on top might make it feel more achievable to do a little bit more on top of that, rather than it feeling like an impossible mountain to climb.
The other side is that when Mark's looking at his Nest investment performance and whatever, it is another, because you have this underpin, it is another reason why actually you can stay in equities for longer, and maybe that's in the interest of the people. So it is an important element for people on low paid, I think.
In the back.
Yeah, Brian Henderson here from Mercer. A bit of a random thought. Picking up on Joe's observations, as a social experiment, auto-enrolment's been, you could argue, has been pretty successful. Whichever way you cut it, it does look good. And so my random thought is, given auto-enrolment has been successful in that case, there are other social issues out there do you think that an auto-enrolled solution might solve? And I'm thinking of like debt. So I'm putting it to the panel as a kind of random thought. Is there any learnings that we can pick up from pension savings and how that's been successful, and apply it into other areas of social issue?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I think there are lots of social issues out there that can be resolved using automatic enrolment. For example, we all know the example of organ donorship, things like that, right? I think the one thing that I'm wary of with automatic enrolment is it really works to that first step, but then you really have to see what happens afterwards and think about how people are then interpreting that in the context of their everyday lives. So I think for issues where there is a one-off point, I think it's a great solution. But I'd say for anything else, so things like debt it's not something that can be resolved with a one-off. But I think having an automatic enrolment as a starting point where then you can kind of examine the different pathways after that, I think that would be something that could work. But it's not an area I've looked at very much. But yeah, I think it's an interesting possibility.
It's certainly interesting to consider as we go forward with the sidecar savings trial, where the current structure is that an individual would opt in to building up that emergency savings buffer through their payroll deductions. We are interested to see what levels of participation we get under those conditions. We've obviously got very different conditions now when it comes to automatic enrolment into pension saving. I think it's a really interesting question.
On the debt side of things, there have been some interesting experiments done, I think both in the US and the UK, around, we call it loan to savings, you call it something else. Sorry, I should be more conversant before I'm up here and bilingual. But the idea of paying off your debt and having it go directly into a savings account post. So a one-time decision around your debt that then can build habits and build savings over time. Maybe interesting. Yes, ma'am, in the front.
Yvonne Sonsino, Mercer, building on Brian Henderson at Mercer's random thought about auto-enrolment. Social care and the cost of elder care is the big next horrendous burden that we're going to have to fund. And Brian's just triggered a idea in my head that possibly auto-enrolment into a social care fund or a fund saving for your own elder care might be a good idea. Has anybody thought about that yet, or what's the panel's views on that as a possibility?
I don't know. I can't say that I know anyone who's been thinking about that. At MICRA, there's a lot of work going on around social care and how best to provide for it. The overwhelming thing the thing I found quite interesting from my research is people hadn't really thought about their future, their retirement much at all, even the older people in the sample. But sometimes people did come out with these statements about funding care in later life. I think there's been a lot of narrative, especially in the kind of Daily Mail press around, oh, you save all your life and then it gets taken away for social care. I think there's a huge amount of work to do in that area, and one that is a big concern. So I don't know of anyone specifically working the idea of a social care fund, but I think it is a really interesting possibility.
Anyone not from Mercer? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, so social care is just crying out for some form of collective insurance, and the Dill Knot report, which is a fantastic piece of work, provided partial insurance by limiting the total amount that an individual was liable for their own social care, which is a fantastic model. It's a shame that it wasn't implemented.
Great. We have in the back.
Tom Lloyd, Department for Work and Pensions. Quick question for Dr. James. Since you mentioned in your research that the market investor group hadn't really been aware of charges as a thing, I was wondering if the skeptical group, that was something that they mentioned, or if their concerns were more sort of intangible, general things?
Frequently, yes, they did mention charges. The skeptical speculators were actually the group that had done the most investigation. They knew things like charges, investment fund rates. Some of them had been to one-on-one advice sessions and felt it was just utter gobbledygook, which was interesting. So I don't know whether this is just their skepticism being underlined, but the people who did mention charges were the skeptical speculators. And that was often part of why they thought other investments were better, because they said, right, I'm saving into a pension, but then I'm getting all these charges and I don't really understand them. I'd rather just save in an ISA where I know what I'm getting.
And we have a question in the front, if we can get a microphone up here.
Thank you. Tim Pike, Pensions Policy Institute. Based on the framing of Dr. James's typologies and so on, and trying to think longitudinally, are people capable of transitioning between these typologies over time? And if so, what are the sort of mechanisms and who might take responsibility for trying to nudge people towards the more positive of these typologies?
Interesting question. Yes, there were transitions over time. So the transition where people kind of stopped being a threshold adult and moved onwards, that was quite clear. There did seem to be a bit of a transition as well where skeptical speculators and market investors and the protectionist people felt that over time they would become a market investor, but it wasn't clear on what would lead them to behave more in that way. And I think mainly it was just having more resources, so being able to build up a bigger portfolio where they could invest in different things. The one thing I felt came through was it wasn't necessarily about financial literacy or education. I think a lot of the time we would say, give people more education, more knowledge to help them become more like market investors. But actually the market investors felt that they'd sought out financial experience, so education or whatever, because they already had this underlying way of approaching their finances. So I'm not entirely sure that the transition could be influenced by financial education then, for example. I think it would be mostly about building up more resources that they could operate in a more kind of portfolio-based way across their savings platform. But obviously not everyone will probably reach that stage. Thank you.
Hello. Andreas Hunter from Buck. To build on that, we've been talking a lot about defaults. We've been talking a lot about how we can get people to maybe move outside of those. And in line with the question earlier, I don't think we're talking really enough about the employers and how they deal with all of this kind of thing. So if we're looking at the amount of effort it takes to shift some of these things and how potentially education and engagement, which we're always told is such an important thing, may not actually work, shouldn't we be mostly spending time trying to change the defaults?
Yeah, I do agree. I think defaults are a really helpful thing. I wouldn't do away with defaults. I think we've got to be careful about how we communicate those and the pathways that are on from those. So I think there could be some really simple wins by working with the kind of experiences people already have. So for example, the threshold adults, the clearest example, they said things like, you know, once I buy a house, that's when I'll engage. Once I have children, that's when I'll engage, once I get a job. They said those things to me, and then there was this other group of adults who actually seemed to have followed through on those things. So is there a way that we can, employers could help support that process? For example, if you know someone has just bought a house or had a child, which employers do know through their systems, could you then send a notification following that saying, cool, we know you've bought a house, how about thinking about your pension now? Capitalising on those sort of milestones. So yeah, I don't think it's about getting rid of the default, it's more about thinking about what comes next, how do we support people in the next steps?
Yeah, we'll pick up our last question from this gentleman right here, and I'll just say, as the microphone's getting there, the user experience for the individual and the user experience for an employer in our work we found are equally important. So how do you make this design easy for that employer and that individual? Yes, sir.
Hi, it's Adrian Bolding from Dunstan Thomas. We've had a lot of research this morning about contributions, focusing very much on the inputs into pension schemes. I'm wondering if we're focusing on the wrong thing. The data's told us only 57% of people were aware of what they were inputting into the pension scheme. The data in terms of what was the impact of increasing the inputs showed us that debt didn't move significantly, other savings weren't impacted significantly. Perhaps what's of importance to individuals is not inputs but outputs. Should we be focusing more on what pension are people actually going to receive, and looking at ways that can, you know, influence them and influence their behaviour?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point. I wouldn't disagree at all. I think actually what I'm trying to show in my research is even the people who were the most kind of savvy about these decisions still weren't really able to think about the outcomes. I do think, though, there's probably a concern against just blanket saying everyone should think about their future, because it's so hard and it comes with it a whole load of fears and insecurities that we might further, you know, damage the cause by just saying think about your future. But I do think there's something there to explore, yeah.
I mean, it would be expensive, but it would be very valuable if Nest could offer free financial planning advice to people, paid by someone who is paid a salary to offer free financial advice to people. That would be very helpful.
That's our time. Thank you very much to the three panelists. This was great.